okay? I think this seat here is first. Okay, I'm coming. I just.
Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for staying with us. It was a rollicking and provocative morning, and we look forward to the same this afternoon. I'm going to introduce the moderator, and the moderator will take it from there. And it is a great pleasure to once again be able, in a different circumstance, to introduce Kennedy Joseph, who is, as everybody knows, an associate professor of English at York College, CUNY. She specializes in world Anglophone literature with an emphasis on Caribbean literature. Her book, which all of you should read if you haven't yet read, Disturbers of the... I'll get a royalty cut from you. Disturbers of the Peace, Representations of Insanity in Anglophone Caribbean Literature, which was published in 2013, that looks at the ubiquity of madmen and madwomen in Caribbean literature between 1959 and 1980. She is currently working on a new book, tentatively entitled Caribbean Articulation, Storytelling in a Digital Age, that aims to explore the intersections between new technologies and Caribbean cultural production. But most importantly for me, she is the editor of Essex Salon, and that platform has grown into a central location for the discussion of Caribbean literary practice. She also manages the Caribbean Commons website. So, Kelly J, over to you. I get a percentage of that.
That is I will introduce. I think what I'll do is I'm just thinking I would introduce before you speak each time, rather than do the introduction right away. So Honorford Smith will be speaking first, and then Brian Meeks will be next. So Honorford Smith is associate professor in the Community and Environmental Arts at the Faculty of Environmental Studies at York University in Toronto, Canada. Her most recent work focuses on memory, urban violence, and performance in Jamaican communities, and includes the performance cycle Letters from the Dead, a series of interventions in commemorating those who have died as a result of state violence and the violence of armed strongmen. Her publications include the well-known Lionheart Gal, Life Stories of Jamaican Women, with Sistren, which was published by the University of the West Indies Press in Kingston, and also Jamaican Plays, 1976 to 1986, also published in Kingston, and last but not least, My Mother's Last Dance, an anthology of poems published by Sister Vision Press in Toronto. I will now give you the book. I was not exactly 40 minutes.
Yes. No more.
I was sort of half tempted not to do the paper, but to just open up for discussion because there have been so many interesting questions. Can you hear? There's so many interesting questions raised that I myself want to pursue, and this paper just takes one small piece of a larger conversation. So I have some dissatisfaction with that. But I also wanted to begin because whenever I have to talk about this period and about the work in Sistren, which I've resisted doing for about 20 years. The last time I talked about it was the end of the 80s. It's quite painful, and I'm sure you would have experienced something like that. I wanted to talk about it by remembering, asking you to remember with me one of the stalwarts of Sistren, a woman named Vivette Lewis, whose narrative in Lionheart Gal, I think I can out her as the author of Veteran by Veteran, because I don't think she's likely to be killed anymore, as she's already dead. Vivette, I want to dedicate this presentation to her memory as one of the key people in the group. She lived on the border of Arnett Gardens and Lima in the 70s and suffered a lot in the armed conflict then. And I think she really never recovered from that and migrated to Canada, where she later died, but not without having achieved her dream of buying a house in Jamaica. She finally bought a house in Highgate. It was her life's dream to buy and to own a house. So this is for Vivette. In her meditation on the questions raised by memory and violence, Elizabeth Jellin offers some tools to think about the past. Among them, she stresses the importance of attentiveness to the silences that lurk in the meanings given the past. Memory, she tells us, is subjective, but anchored in experiences and in material and symbolic spheres. The meanings given to the past change and must be historicized. Always contested, memory is made and remade across time. She reminds us that this process of making memory is labor. It relies on the work of active subjects, as it is us who produce the meanings of the past. Most importantly, she reminds us that the meanings of the past and the present have to do with desire for futures. But the past is gone. It can't be changed. But the future is open, uncertain, indeterminate. What can change about the past is its meaning. And the importance of struggling over the meanings of the past is not to mythologize its emancipatory moments or its violence as inevitable, but rather to find a way to use it as we make the present. My dear friend and colleague Elisa Trotz points out that the conventional narrative of the 1970s in the Caribbean focuses on the defeat of the left and its failure to reconstitute itself in the present. And I quote, "The narrative that we tend to unproblematically circulate or rely on is one which asserts the collapse of the left following the defeat of the Grenada Revolution. This is seen as ushering in the Washington Consensus, which leads to the inauguration of neoliberalism in the region. This presents the story of a coherent left that was united against imperialism, and even when we come to reflect on the divisions of the Grenada Revolution, it is still presented as a mere internal tension. In fact, there are always multiple tendencies, differences, and conflicts. What would it mean to complicate this narrative of a united left, and to think of all those fissures in the left together?" Unquote. A similar story of defeat is circulated around Jamaica in the 1970s, as well as strident narratives of the endlessly flawed nature of the experiment on the part of both the left and the right. There is perhaps a far less binary telling of the story of what happened in the 1970s that can be pieced together, patchwork-like, and used. Such an approach will produce less of a unified narrative than a sense of incomplete projects, the silences, the gaps, the fissures between them, the overlapping and different ideas about what could be accomplished, thought and felt, the holes and spaces into which we might jump to continue the things that were interrupted. What follows then is less a coherent narrative than just a set of ideas and lines of inquiry emerging at the time and after from one experience of struggling for an alternative. I draw attention to these lines of inquiry because I think that engaging with them on their own terms might inform methodologically projects that make up and help to develop an archive. All that I accomplish in this fragmented piece is the setting of the stage by drawing out some key ideas that I think might be important to help establish a method for thinking both about what took place and what we might do with it now in this very violent present. First, I take up Sylvia Wynter's 1995 work on colonial epistemologies and representation in relation to questions of decolonization as a way to think about work on women and the body. And second, I start a reappraisal of Rex Nettleford's discussion of embodied, quote-unquote, cultural marinage as an attempt to approach decolonial knowledge production through performance. I then begin to apply some of these ideas to an analysis of the work of Sistren, moving between the performative aspect of our work on stage and off stage as an organization. So I'm thinking about performance here as action and not just as something that happens on the stage. And I think that what's interesting about performance is that it moves between representation and live embodiment in the here and now. So just a few words about Sistren for those of you who don't know it. From 1977 until 1990, Sistren Theatre Collective labored to do the hard work of addressing gender, race, and class inequality through cultural work and performance in particular. As is well documented elsewhere, Sistren was created in the 70s, in the moment of democratic socialism, and was both somewhat maverick and somewhat typical of the energies of the time. Over the years that I was involved with Sistren, we produced a body of collectively created plays, a book of life histories, a small magazine, a collection of screen prints, 3 films that survived, and research into the history of women's struggles. We also undertook a program of popular education locally and regionally, and by the time that I left Sistren in 1991, we had developed a group of an organization of sister groups which existed in grassroots communities in rural and urban Jamaica. Our work narrated women's experiences and struggles in Jamaica while privileging the stories of Black working class women. 2 of the plays from the period have been published, and there is considerable archive of unpublished material, in spite of a fire which destroyed the headquarters in the 1990s. Sistren was also one of the first Black feminist collectives in the Americas, a part of a larger constellation of women's organizations emerging in the 1970s within and alongside the social movements of the time. Sistren's work toured locally, regionally, and internationally, and the collective had considerable impact both regionally and in diaspora, far beyond its size. In many ways, and in a specific context, Sistren's work anticipated debates around intersectionality of oppressions, which are usually mapped out through a discussion of work in the United States and more broadly in North America. But Gail Lewis of the Brixton Black Women's Group in London gives a good description of the ways in which Sistren intervened. She says, and I quote, "It wasn't just meeting them, it was also knowing of them, that they existed in the world. It's moving to see the film Sweet Sugar Age again and be reminded of the depth of the work, both in terms of the practice of it and the conception of what might be done through cultural production to reveal structural inequalities and the processes that lead to the reproduction of those inequalities. The notion of it as a mode of practice to bring together people from different communities, to begin to intervene in the world in ways that help form communities, as that did," unquote. She explains that as a Black feminist group, the Brixton Black Women's Collective were always getting told off, and that's a quote, because they were active and vocal on questions of childcare, law, and offered a critique of feminism as it existed then in terms of its narrowness around race, class, and around anti-imperial struggles. Sistren, she claims, was authorizing of anti-racist feminist work, both in terms of solidarity, anti-imperialism, and in terms of its approach. It was, she claimed, also authorizing of a discussion of Black lesbian feminism. I don't think that was the case in Jamaica, but elsewhere I have argued that the ruptures with the past that social movements produce are never absolute. As Stuart Hall tells us, such ruptures never achieve an absolute break with what they attempt to overturn. There is never a finite end to emancipation. In Freedom Dreams, African-American scholar Robin Kelly argues that it is perhaps less important to critique the failed dreams of liberation or chronicle the failures of liberation than it is, and I quote, that it is to recover ideas, visions, fashioned mainly by marginalized black activists who propose a different way out of our constrictions, tap the well of our collective imaginations, that we do what earlier generations have done, dream. It is in the narratives of liberation that we find the optimism of the will, the energy, and indeed the inspiration, not just to point out injustice, but also to begin the very hard work of creating change. One of the principles that these narratives begin from is the impulse to decolonization. And now I want to talk about the methodological theories underlying the methodology that I briefly mentioned at the start. So, Sylvia Wynter. In a project that she initiated after the 70s, Sylvia Wynter points to one of the key cultural challenges of decolonization. She argues that while post-colonial societies have changed in many ways, they continue to repeat the exclusions and dominations of the colonial period because they remain tied to colonial epistemologies. She draws on Foucault to ask the questions, what are the rules for the rules? For Wynter, all knowledge is based on the assumptions underlying established epistemes. These condition how we know, and they condition what we are able to know. They condition what we're able to see and not see in any given situation. And she argues that these assumptions change only when individuals or groups demonstrate the contradictions within the framework in obvious ways, throwing the rules underlying the knowledge into crisis. She argues that these epistemological errors show up in the areas of knowledge that are on the margins of a given episteme. And Paget Henry takes this a bit further by arguing that the errors usually are compounded when they try to represent whatever is outside of the episteme's conceptual schema. And these errors are greatest with objects that occupy the point that is most antithetical, most radically other to the core of the schema. This antithetical point Wynter labels the liminal category. And there are a couple of examples of this, but one of the ones that she uses is the idea that the revolt of colonized subjects that gained momentum in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, sort of is one moment in which you can see epistemological assumptions beginning to crumble. And she argues that Frantz Fanon's 1967 work takes this challenge further by demonstrating that the work done by representation in the process of creating human subjects is very important in terms of demonstrating how at fault the episteme is. So she argues that a new poetics must take representation seriously and replace the concept of man with that of the human subject. So she places representation as central to the way in which we are constituted as conscious, knowing subjects. She starts from the margins. I think that this, she doesn't really give an account of the implications of her analysis for women or for the disabled people or for gender non-conforming groups or for impoverished people. She doesn't elaborate on any of this. Neither does she speak to the question of embodied production of knowledge. But still, I think that her point about representation is an important place to begin with a reappraisal of the method of work with life histories that was deployed in Sistren's work. At the moment of Sistren's beginning, there were two important contextual representational factors into which the work was inserted. The first was the increased debate about the relationship between women's role and women's struggles in and for decolonization, brought to the forefront by the work of women's movement like that of the PNP, Women's Organization, and the Committee of Women for Progress, which we actually mentioned earlier. I want to remind you that gender here had not yet been invented as an analytical category. It was being invented in contradiction or in contradistinction to the category of woman and man at the time. And woman, thus, as a category, was both sexual and gendered and embodied. It wasn't just a social thing. The fact of these organizations was serious, the work of these organizations at the time was seriously complicated by the fact that details around women's anti-colonial struggles in the past in the Caribbean had failed to enter circulating discourses on nation. The extraordinary work of women in Robert Love's People's Convention, which Rupert actually is one of the key people that brought this to light, I think in the 70s, no? In the 70s or 80s, that article about the writing of Amy Bailey in Public Opinion in the 1930s. These were little known by the generation born after 1950. Prior to 1938 and after, both Una Marson and Amy Bailey's work had consistently registered protests around the labor conditions facing working class women and black middle class women. Bailey's work centered on questions of both race and gender and had led to women's access to professions, to birth control, and to women's representation on parochial boards and legislative council. But her work had dropped out of popular memory by 1972, and if she was remembered at all, it was as a woman who had set out to professionalize domestic service in an ill-fated attempt to make caring labor respectable. The figure who haunted the present in terms of black women was a large-bodied, masculinized black woman, or the mammy, as she's called in scholarship on African Americans. The several incarnations of this African woman has a complex and much discussed genealogy that I can't go into here. Suffice it to say that visual images of it date back as far as the early, that I found, date back as far as the anti-abolitionist cartoons of Johnny Newcomb. I don't know if you know those. They were produced in the 18th century. And portrayed black women as hulking, grotesque figures preying on the frailty of small, skinny white men, as well as stressing exaggerated clumsiness and aggressive sexuality. The image justified the exploitation of labor and differentiated black women from the ideal white women who were pictured as small, leisured, chaste, and physically weak. The second representation that haunted us was that of the oversexed Jezebel, a willing sexual receptacle or a tough negotiator of sexual favors offered to bushers and plantation owners in return for money or better conditions. So discourses on black women's sexuality had become a significant determinant of Caribbean writing one way or another for a long time after slavery, as Rhonda Cobham-Sander points out. Black middle-class women writers and performers attempted to evade the reach of colonial discourses on their sexuality. Louise Bennett, who used the persona of the working class black woman, although of course she wasn't working class, constantly negotiated the pitfalls of the stereotypical mammy, while she also negotiated that of the Jezebel. Bennett, as you will remember, dressed in a bandana, was large-bodied, but she also satirized the establishment. She satirized the excesses of heterosexual attraction and romantic rituals, and although she came out of the Jamaica Federation of Women initially, she wasn't beyond making fun of their mass marriage campaigns. And she commented on interracial sexual relations as problematic. In performance, Miss Lou downplayed her own sexuality. That the stereotypical vulgar black woman cast a shadow on her work is perhaps borne out best by her comment, "Nobody could ever say I was vulgar. I never was." In attempting to avoid this shadow, folks became became enmeshed in Victorian discourses on domesticity, respectability, and race. And by the 1950s and 60s, colonial representations gave way to the literature of sociology on the region, which had serious material effects. This work took two directions. The fact that black unmarried women were household heads were interpreted as deviant from the ideal of female domesticity. And the institution of slavery was seen as having led to the destruction of black male authority, and family life was pathologized. The African Caribbean single mother was demonized, and matrifocal families were thought to have emasculating effects on men. All this resulted in policies that attempted to remake women as housewives who lived in nuclear families in which they were supposed to be supported by male breadwinners who didn't really exist in the context of the Caribbean, given the levels of male unemployment and the fact that the male labor force was always having to move in order to find work. This scholarship and its institutional effects wasn't challenged until the 1970s, and I like to think that some of the work that we did in those days intervened in this representation. Our first play, Belly Woman Bangarang, which was produced in 1978, can be read as an example of work that talks back to this myth. It tells a coming-of-age story of 4 working-class women, and is now seen as quite mild, but at the time of its production it was controversial because it tackled questions of sexuality, domestic and sexual abuse, and focused almost entirely on the felt reality of working-class girls. What it did importantly was to insert a vulnerability into the representation of working-class women, which was regarded as troubling. And although the early work did not completely break with the prevailing discourses that existed on worthless men, it did remove the blame from women. This discussion of sexuality was also controversial, not only because it hearkened to the question of vulnerability, but also because it focused on everyday lived gender relations around caring labor, rape, and violence. It was critiqued for not focusing enough on large material structures that produce those realities. Such a contestation on the dominant representations of the time rested on a claim to Sistren's representativeness. Sistren's authority, culturally and politically, rested on its claim to be comprised of authentic grassroots subjects presenting their everyday experience, giving voice to the invisible, transparent experience of the oppressed. And in fact, that is how we presented ourselves, as an essential group of working-class women whose experience, as one piece of publicity proclaimed, written I think by one of the middle-class women, on open quote, was living testimony to the meaning of oppression, unquote. Such representativeness is always a tension in autobiographical work and social movements, since it is that testimonial work which is used to make claims to agitate for change. And as Spivak pointed out long ago, such notions of representativeness are always mediated by the authorizing presence of power and by the gaze of the dominant. In our case as an organization, there were significant differences of race, class, age, and so on among us. While in the early years, the majority of the group were black and working class women from the same Make Work program which Rupert mentioned earlier on, the crash program, established to give work to unemployed mothers, there were significant differences among these women. Some were urban, some were rural. There were differences of age, there were differences of political party allegiance. On the other hand, the organization also depended upon the labor of a number of middle strata women, some of whom were for all practical purposes in the context of Jamaica white or near white, yours truly. Some of whom were for all practical purposes in the context of Jamaica brown. The differences between our subject positions were never fully elaborated, partly because of the attempt to make claims for the category woman, but also because of the unitary category nation. We women of the social strata never found time, space, or language to work on the different ways in which the project of decolonization actively resonated in our lives, to question the assumptions of colonial education which had shaped us. While we constantly castigated ourselves about our privilege and were often castigated about our privilege, it was not a priority to rethink our own subject positions in terms of where we fitted in that relational dyad, colonizer-colonized, and to think about how decolonization might reshape our own identities in the context of the material crisis faced by many of our members. We chose instead to focus on the ways in which working class experience had been disfigured and abused. There is one play, Bus Out, which was produced in the 1980s, which explores differences of class and color through the character of an ambitious light-skinned activist who railroads working class women into a struggle against a rapacious landlord. When confrontation time comes, it is the working class women who suffer the repressive consequences as the activist does not occupy the same social space and her class exempts her from the violent consequences which leave the women worse off than when they started. Echoing in a way Brian's novel. But at the same time, and in contradiction to this, the awareness of difference was mediated in an undifferentiated structure of governance called the General Meeting. Now, here is one of I think the most important contributions that we made, and I think it's worth thinking about in more detail and more time than is available now. But we had a non-hierarchical structure, and the decisions were made in a collective body that didn't differentiate along the lines of respectability or hierarchy, responsibility or hierarchy, that is. While there were always sources of informal power that I've discussed at length in Reading in a Tight Corner, a monograph, there was also enormous solidarity across difference, loyalty, and an ongoing commitment to struggle together even as we struggled with each other. And it is this principle which I think can effectively work to undermine the idea of that difference within these organizations, it ultimately results in collapse. We fought over the uses that were to be made of material resources, the use of time, the division of labor, the allocation of responsibility, sexuality, commitments to future learning, and most of all, accountability, bad behavior, and bad mind. I know few workplaces in the world where such an active, exemplary, exhausting, and time-consuming practice of decision-making were undertaken. The result was admirable, but very tiring, especially in the context of the 80s, which, in my experience, was much more violent than the 70s, with attacks taking place on our work in the public spaces repeatedly. Okay, so now I want to go to the other point that I was making. How much time do I have left? Am I finished?
No, you have about 10 minutes.
Okay, so now I want to talk about the second methodological preoccupation which I have, which is around this question of how you undermine representations. And it's there that I want to turn to a discussion of Nettleford. So, a second methodological contribution to decolonial knowledge production, I think, comes up around the way in which work that is not represented verbally or written work might contribute to a countering of colonial epistemologies that naturalize social hierarchies. So this nod to embodied knowledge enables us to ask, how does knowledge which is not written or represented in the colonial archive factor into knowledge production? Much of what was investigated, taught, and presented in drama, theatre, and other forms of performance in the 1970s was an explicit attempt to find a way to both explore and authorize knowledge produced at the margins of the Western archive and to attend to the embodied knowledge developed outside of these systems. Such an approach to knowledge production was part of a general attempt to bring about decolonization through attentiveness to the lessons of resistance and alternatives lived in the everyday. So while scholars such as Monroe and Beckford addressed questions of political economy and plantation at the structural level, they didn't explore the affective, embodied aspects of such systemic structures. Performance scholar Diana Taylor theorizes performance as a site for the production and reproduction of knowledge outside of Western archival forms. And she argues that social groups can pass on histories and resistant memories through what she calls acts of transfer. That is, embedded in those forms of meaning-making which remain outside of the domain of the written. While these acts are not completely separated from the written form and are never completely separated, they nonetheless rely on embodiment as a site of knowledge creation. And she calls these repertoires. She calls these acts repertoires of knowledge and argues that they allow for contestation. Theorizing acts of transfer help us to think about how knowledge can be produced by groups excluded from formal systems of knowledge production. And put simply, in such situations of confrontation and domination, the body becomes what Susan Simpson calls a vast reservoir of signs and symbols. It shakes up the binary distinction between signifier and signified, and in so doing can become a site of persuasion rather than, as it is usually seen, a site of unpredictable irrationality that opposes action and thought. The body, then, can become a way of both inhabiting and subverting dominant representations that justify hierarchies of race and gender, and it also can become a way of marking, storing, and reproducing cultural differences from those who exploit the body. It's not an original insight to say that enslaved people had to rely on the codes stored in their bodies and voices to express resistant reflections and their understandings of the situation. Over 3 centuries, in a variety of contexts, embodied repertoires of meaning came to reproduce themselves as forms of resistant communication, until they acquired a dynamic of their own in a situation of extreme domination where inequity was so fundamental that dialogue was suppressed. In such a context, those bumped out of the category human so as to be commodified as things proved constantly their humanity through the living body. This language, a poetics of the human body perhaps, is one way to create cultural capital in the context of extreme domination. Now, I want to be very careful here. I'm not arguing that only African or subordinated people produce embodied knowledge, or that this impulse is somehow essential to the black body, as colonial racial stereotypes propose. Neither am I arguing that all embodied knowledge is automatically an act of resistance. All people produce embodied knowledge. But the significance of the context of enslavement is that other avenues of knowledge production were closed, and this closure violently enforced through the body. So the body itself, the target of knowledge, becomes a strategic location for meaning-making in the face of violence. The decolonial contribution of Nettlefoot, I think, was built on his recognition of the importance of embodied knowledge, on his effort to enact a project of knowledge creation through a careful negotiation of the embodied and the archival. This project peaked in the 1970s when he actively created the conceptual basis with Neville Dawes, who we've been talking about and discussing as well. And it was this for the partnership between Nettleford and Dawes that resulted in the conceptual basis for the institution's Africa Caribbean Institute and the Cultural Training Center, which were dedicated to investigating embodied knowledge creation. So far, Rex's work has been treated as an example of nationalism. I think this is part of it, but it's not the full story. As opposed to the much contested but still prevalent separation of mind-body in Western knowledge, I think, therefore I am, I read Nettleford's work as an attempt to theorize decolonization as an embodied process, recalling Fanon's famous invocation, "Oh my body, make of me always a man that questions." Nettleford maintains that dance was both a primary instrument of survival and cultural resistance, arguing, and I quote, first, dance is a skill that depends on the physical and mental capacities of the survivor. One's body belongs only to oneself, despite the laws governing chattel slavery in the English-speaking Caribbean, which until 1834 allowed a person to be the property of another. Second, the language by which the body expresses itself does not have to be anybody else's language, least of all the master's. Even when there are borrowings, they can be given shape and form on the borrower's terms. These strategies are crucial in a situation of dependency where all influences are dictated by the overlord. A hold on any activity beyond the control of a cynical power is a valuable weapon of self-defense. Nettleford's point here is that the body, even in a context in which it is envisioned as a thing, cannot ever become a thing as long as embodied movement acts to make meaning visible outside the domains of institutions of knowledge and cannot be easily pinned down or even represented by dominant codes. There is an elaborate silence around Rex Nettleford's queerness and the fact of his dissident masculinity. I cannot read this here or speak about what Rex might have had to say about it, but what I can say is perhaps his own dissidence and gender nonconformity enabled his ability to understand the way in which meaning can be created beyond the social identities authorized by language and social institutions. While the scenarios of performance remain and are repeated, the immediacy of action, sound, and chemistry it produces with the bodies of its audience disappear in time, eluding the fixity of colonial power as institution. Performance or public action operate as forms of knowledge that remain at the edge of discursive representation because what they produce is always imminent. That is, it is always about to happen and it cannot be limited to the materiality of the moment. Perhaps this is what Nettleford meant when he spoke about the dance as a valuable weapon of self-defense. Rather than the Descartesian dichotomy in which mind masters vulgar body and determines existence, his formulation proposes a way around the mind-body split, which is an essential way of contesting colonial knowledge systems. The meaning-making body comes into being in the context of coercion and violence and is sustained by what he called the worship of forbidden gods. This maverick existence at the crossroads of the embodied and the sacred and secular was critical to his idea of cultural marinage. Drawing on the work of anthropologists of marinage, Nettleford argued that the dance as moving space, I think that's really critical, moving space operating through the immanence of secrecy, cunning, and fugitive sensibilities. For Nettleford, marinage wasn't a romance of rebellion, it was a strategy. It was a way of, and when translated into dance, it brought community into being from which other challenges could later be remembered and mounted. The dance was an existential space in a topography called home, as much as it was a process of finding a way home. A world ends, Garcia Canclini tells us, not only when the answers have to be archived, but also when the questions that give rise to them lose their meaning. This path of work with the body, its memories, and its action is a way of asking new questions when put into dialogue with other areas of social and political thought. It is not a complete rupture. It is rather an embrace of conflicting forces so as to make them generative of something new. It is about the productivity of ambivalence. I have a persistent image of Rex as an embodiment of the archetypal Legba, the guardian of the crossroads. It is Legba who opens a space that is sufficiently opaque as to allow reasoning, understanding, and exchange to take place across multiple axes of difference, time, discipline, and space. I used to see Rex most often, though I was too young to really talk to him, most often in the 70s when I worked at the Cultural Training Center where Katrina now works. He created the conceptual brief for the school of art, dance, and drama, and proposed that the college produce something that he called a cultural agent. Someone who is not a conventional teacher, but someone who is transdisciplinary, artistically skilled, but also competent to carry out social research, teach their art, and organize community and social programming in the art. This was the antithesis of the Western idea of the individualized artist. Researchers, dancers, and musicians observed and recorded traditional dances, spoken languages. They documented and discussed what they found in Pokomina yards, in Rasta meetings, to make visible, imaginatively transposing them to the classroom. This was how popular culture began to enter the classroom in Jamaica. They found their way onto urban stages, to schools and community groups organized into dance and music curriculum, becoming recognizable. Could this, but Nettleford never transferred this research to the University of the West Indies. Could this have to do with the way in which the body is denigrated and marginalized within the academy? I'll skip that because I think I'm running out of time. So I could give you another example of how in the practice of creating a dramatic methodology, we try to work with this rather opaque conception of embodied decolonial knowledge production, but we can leave that for the questions. I just want to conclude by saying that scholarship on Sistren commonly takes it up as an example of Caribbean feminism, as a tentative representation of working class feminist knowledge production in the context of a social movement that brings together questions of class and race. It reads the work in relation to debates on citizenship, development, and the political. Locating Sistren is a feminist example of a broader method of embodied decolonial pedagogical work in the 70s can, I think, be one way to approach some of the ways in which questions around decolonial knowledge production in an embattled context can be furthered. I have attempted to trace some of the ways in which a methodology that stresses representation arising through the body and at the margin of dominant cultural representation can be one path to the production of decolonial subjects. Many questions arise and many concerns. Can such a method work in a variety of different contexts? What happens when this discussion is placed outside of the context of social movements and struggles for transformation? How far would Nettleford's covert notion of cultural marriage exist without the context of domination? Do they not lend themselves to nativism, as Stylie calls it, or worse yet, appropriation? Is such a method ever immune from domestication? Do such methods propose an aestheticization of the political which resists dialogical interrogation? I hope we might pursue these comments in further discussion. Thank you.
So next we have Brian Meeks, who is professor and chair of Africana Studies at Brown University. He served previously as director of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute for Social and Economic Studies and director of the Center for Caribbean Thought at the University of the West Indies, Mona campus. He has published 11 volumes and edited collections on Caribbean politics and thought, including a novel, Paint the Town Red. Did this go away?
It seems to.
Okay. You just have to angle exactly like, and Paint the Town Red. His collection of poems from the 70s, titled The Ku Klux Cliques, will be published by People Tree Press in 2018.
To thank Dammit, David, Daniel Botham, and I've never had the chance, David, to, I don't know if the appropriate thing is to congratulate the Small Axe Project for having sustained for over 2 decades a project of interrogating the Caribbean. One of the last times I spoke with Rex Nicholson to draw on Rex, as Anna has brought him into the discussion, he said, whatever you're doing, do it consistently. And I think maybe he said the same thing to you. He usually pulled anybody aside he could and gave them a story, but he certainly told me that, and I think that you definitely have sustained it. So the many members of the collective in the room, so I congratulate you all. When Donald Francis asked me to write a paper for the seminar on the 70s, I had recently uncovered, dusted off, and compiled a collection of my own poems, all written between 1971 and 1988. These, as Kelly mentioned, are to be published in 2018 under the title The Ku Klux Cliques, taken from a poem I wrote about the burgeoning violence in Kingston, Jamaica in the mid-70s. A couple of people in this room know me, and very few know me as a poet. They know me as an itinerant academic. Well, for the first 10 to 15 years of my post-high school existence, I thought of myself first as a poet. That is another story which, if I have time, I'll speak about. The process of compiling and preparing these 36 short poems is in itself a somewhat longer story worth telling. From at least the age of 15, I felt I had to write. I'd studied the usual range of Western, largely British poets for GCE English literature, and loved every moment of it, from Byron's Ozymandias to Tennyson's Lotus Eaters, Goldsmith's Deserted Village, to Coleridge's Christabel. I found in poetry a vehicle and form that suited my own sense of pace and general impatience with seemingly long-winded narratives. But if the English Romantics turned me on to poetry, 2 locally significant events suggested that my own poetry, if it ever appeared, could be written in an entirely different form. The first was when our 4th form literature teacher, a young Jamaican graduate of the University of the West Indies named Neville Bramwell, decided to play in class on his scratchy, battery-powered Philips player, Hopton Lewis' classic rocksteady hit, Take It Easy. I'm not going to try to sing it, because I would not do. But it goes something like this. Take your time, take it easy. No need to hurry. No slipping, no sliding, no bumping, no boring. I walk right into town. If you fall from the race, it's no disgrace. Just kick yourself from off the ground. I don't remember Bramwell spending time parsing or even trying to extricate social and political meaning from the lyrics. Yet his act of playing rocksteady with its militantly laid-back rhythm, even though the necessary heavy bass was missing from his little 13, was revolutionary. It forcefully brought home to me that this too was poetry, and indeed a more urgent and immediate form that demanded to be listened to, read, analyzed, and understood. Poetry had instantly been freed from its English moorings and antecedents to become a different medium to do what we wanted and wished with it. The earliest Jamaican toasters, DJs, Count Machuki, Prince Buster, King Stitt, and others were of course already deeply involved in investing their dancehall selections with improvised lyrics and were not waiting on any signals of legitimacy from literature professors in order to do their toasting. But for me, and I suggest many others in that class, Val Carnegie might have been around, I suspect, this was the pivotal moment in which the possibility of writing for ourselves and making poetry our own became a reality. The second was listening to Eddie, not yet come on, Brathwaite, read for the first time at the Creative Arts Center, now the Philip Sherlock Center for the Creative Arts, in 1969. This is at UWI Mona. This was the year after Walter Rodney's expulsion from the UWI, and Black Power and Rastafari sentiments were running hot among the Mona student population. They felt that the newly opened CSC was too European in its orientation, and therefore decided to occupy, lock it down, and demand that its curriculum and program change to feature more Black and Afrocentric scholars and artists. A group of us who were senior students at nearby Jamaica College left our campus and joined the occupation in solidarity. That evening, Brathwaite read from Rites of Passage to a small but enraptured audience. Drum skin, whip lash, master's songs, cutting edge of heat, taut surfaces of things. I sing, I shout, I groan, I dream about. I had yet to read any of his poems, but something about his hypnotic tone, calm demeanor, and trenchant delivery in that softened, stentorian Bayesian accent presaged and predicted the style of his short, simple, staccato wordplay as printed on the page. This was for me the Houghton Lewis revelation made concrete. What Brathwaite did in Rites of Passage and eventually in the entire Arrivals trilogy was to use the vehicle of poetry as a finely honed tool and weapon to unmask and understand the long, sordid, but also glorious history of survival of Africans in the West. Here was an endeavor truly worthwhile, and a form that was not only accessible, but allowed room for both intellectual depth and rich artistic compassion. So it was Branwell playing Houghton Lewis, and Brathwaite reading himself, who more than any others opened the door to my writing poetry, which became my dominant expressive art form for more than a decade, continued sporadically in the 80s, and then ended altogether, of which more anon, before the end of that decade. In this, on reflection, relatively truncated period, I was fortunate to cross paths with the other young Jamaican poets, including, notably, Lorna Goodison, Mikey Smith, Akwa Nora, then Orlando Wong, Muta Baruka, then Alan Pope, and among the established writers, particularly Mervyn Morris and Eddie Brathwaite himself, who saw it fit to publish an early poem of mine in the iconic Sabaku 3-4 on New Caribbean poetry, and included my poems with many of these and other emerging voices in Sabaku 14-15, New Poets from Jamaica, which appeared in 1979. Some of these were republished in the iconic and path-breaking 1986 Penguin Book of Caribbean Verse, which, although somewhat mechanical in its separation of the oral from the literary tradition, nonetheless opened the door to the full bandwidth of Caribbean poetic expression, including from the oral end Bob Marley, the Mighty Sparrow, Louis Bennett, and the newer reggae and dub-influenced voices, alongside from the literary Derek Walker, Dennis Scott, and Gene Rees, among others. The project of exploring one's own creative work is fraught and dangerous. It can easily become and be perceived as a supreme instance of self-indulgent vanity, or alternatively a somewhat restrained and dry attempt at merely annotating one's narrowly perceived meaning, reason for writing, and historical orientation. Despite these evident pitfalls, I persist for one simple reason, in that I think that these poems capture quite effectively not only a missing decade and a half of my life, I should say a murky decade and a half of my life, but the crucial period of post-independence radical Caribbean politics, what the Calypsonian Valentino refers to as the roaring 70s. When some 15 years ago, my wife, Patsy, who's fortunately here with me, told me that I must publish my poetry, echoing a sentiment initially given to me by my late mother, I demurred and found every excuse. They had been written too long ago. I was a different person then. They were too specific to events that were, for the most part, largely forgotten. They were all typed out on colored paper with accompanying sketches, and it would be too much trouble to retype them in contemporary digital format. Patsy solved the last problem by retyping them herself and presenting the results to me as a birthday present. I don't want to embarrass her, but it's true. Still, I hesitated until arriving at Brown University in 2015 to chair the Department of Africana Studies with its historic rights and reason theatre. My presence in a superbly interdisciplinary center with a long literary and performing arts tradition, coupled with the distance from the Jamaican context, where I had headed a social sciences center, heavily engaged in policy-oriented studies, opened a window of possibility, and I unsealed my poetry file again. It was a revelation. Somehow in less than 40 typed poems, I felt I had managed to capture the sequence and many of the critical moments which punctuated and helped define the zeitgeist of an era. There were formative poems from the early 70s reflecting the Rastafari tilted mysticism that was an integral part of the re-emergence of radical traditions among young people in the short span between Emperor Selassie's visit to Jamaica in 1966, the exclusion and banning of Walter Rodney in 68, and the election of the Manley government on a wave of popular hope in 72. There was a strong assertion of an emergent and still at the time insufficiently recognized urban popular culture, evident in both the confident utilization of urban, Rasta-inflected Jamaican language, and vistas drawn from Kingston's stark and graphic social and spatial distinctions. There was a powerful reflection of my 3 years as an undergraduate in my mother's country, Trinidad and Tobago, between 1970 and 1973. These were the years immediately following the 1970 Black Power Revolution, when urban Trinbagonian young people, overwhelmingly black, had demonstrated for 3 months for Black Power, a movement which ended with the Eric Williams government declaring a state of emergency, the arrest of the leaders of the movement, and an attempted coup by elements in the military against the government, which was ultimately aborted. The popular mood, however, did not subside with the state of emergency, and for my time in the Twin Islands state, radical ideas and tendencies continued to flourish, among them the guerrilla-oriented National United Freedom Fighters, NUF, the death of whose leader, Guy Harewood, is the subject of one of these poems. There is as a central part of the volume an exploration of the 70s during the Manley regime in Jamaica, when the hesitant steps towards a national democratic transformation was met with a determined, powerful, and ultimately successful reaction. These poems, I think, capture the breadth of the social chasm that divided Jamaica in the 70s and persists today. The urgency and poignancy of the popular expectations for change, and the sheer dangerousness and determination of power, both national and international, as it sought to outmaneuver, ambush, and ultimately strangle the popular movement. There was a brief but riveting reflection on the short-lived Grenada Revolution, where I spent 2 years from 1981 until the weeks before the killing of Morris Bishop, followed by the US-led invasion in October 1983. And in the end, if it can be said that the long 70s began with Rodney's exclusion and the Jamaican riots that followed in 1968 and ended in 1983 with Grenada, there are a series of reflections on the world that followed this period of popular upsurge, the years of returning home and confronting the long, difficult period of neoliberal domination and disillusionment that continues into the present. In Lecture 7 of his 1988 series of talks at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, Stuart Hall developed at length the notions of domination and hegemony, riffing around an approach pioneered by Gramsci, in which both hegemonic and counter-hegemonic ideas are often seen as rooted in and emerging from commonly held perceptions or common sense, Hall stresses the profound importance of exploring, seeking to understand, and logically attempting to change perceptions of what is common sense. Hegemony, Hall suggests, quote, can only be achieved as a historical process, not a thing achieved, unquote. Likewise, counter-hegemony is best understood as a work in progress, requiring careful understanding of a historical conjuncture, the specific cultural, ideological, and linguistic apparatuses that ring with truth, give momentum to popular perceptions of the truth, and provide justification for engagement, commitment, and untold personal sacrifices in support of the cause. This small personal archive, dusted off and uncovered almost as an intact time capsule, can hopefully initiate a conversation around what counter-hegemony in the Caribbean in the long 70s looked like, and even suggest some of the reasons as to why the popular movements of the era achieved some initial success but failed to maintain momentum and were ultimately defeated, though in the face of immense national, regional, and international opposition. A brief caveat before I proceed to look at and read a few poems. I'm not going to attempt or have the temerity to attempt to address the aesthetic quality of these poems. That is for people in this room and elsewhere to do. I'm looking at them through the lens of the archivist reading his own archives. And through the lens of the political theorist, which sometimes I call myself. Rastafari mysticism. To understand the soil out of which radical trends in Jamaican politics re-emerged after the relative hiatus of the 50s and 60s is difficult, nigh impossible, without an appreciation of and reflection on the role of Rastafari. Emperor Selassie's visit to Jamaica in 1966 and the tumultuous welcome he received from tens of thousands of Rastas and non-Rastafari enthusiasts revealed the strength and tenacity of black nationalist currents within the popular culture, most immediately evident in the music. Bob Andy's 1967 song and his first big hit, I've Got to Go Back Home, is emblematic of this moment, both in its capturing of urban alienation, quote, this couldn't be my home, unquote, as it is adherence to key tenets of Rastafarian African redemptionist philosophy, asserting that there is a real home for all black people in Africa. It is almost complete rebellion of Rastafari philosophy and praxis from established Euro-Creole Jamaican norms, its radical purity that is of interest. Rasta's shattered codes of appearance, particularly the wearing of beards and most conspicuously dreadlocks. Language, via the transmutation, inversion, and subversion of already subversive Jamaican language. Ritual, through the substituting of the rituals of brownation, reasoning, and ganja for those of the established church. And philosophy, God as black, Africa as Zion, the West, particularly Jamaica as Babylon, that provided the image and template for young Jamaican radicals. That it was not without its own internal flaws is evident in the traditional adherence to male supremacy in the patriarchal Old Testament aspects of the doctrine, which were adopted and incorporated into various houses, including the Bobo Dreads, who eschewed contacts with women during their menstrual periods, and the 12 tribes of Israel, who gave women one token position alongside their leadership of 12 men. I used two poems, Green Things and One Love Bradley, as examples of the power and seductiveness of the Rasta tradition in the late 60s, early 70s. Green Things 2 is located in a yard during a reasoning and partaking of herbs. Not herbs, hers. None of the participants make any profound statement of philosophy or principle, but it is a reflection on shared experiences, the silences between the infrequent utterances that are important. They are like intermittent strums in a rock-steady beat. Che-che, che-che. Together, silences and companionship quietly forge unity and common purpose. Greetings too. red dust, sunbaked, junk iron, bedpost, outer dust bowl, Aki seedling declares, I like, blue denim, striped, pants length, avoid snail encrusted board. Mind your bust down a tree, you know, brethren, for I watch it grow them last days, yeah. Joe man, remember the Coptic house in the Coptic days in the old Maca house? For in them time the word sounded a little dread, see? Man and daughters rest away one side, and our eyes observing no sight of mud or water, even sun-baked cracks, absent without leaves, crab walking. Cheche, 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 cheche. Monotonously, sunlight stirs, smoky breeze, denim eases, shifts, settles, seedling grows, green leaves sprout, dust, chlorophyll, cover, broad, highly off, seed. The late brother Leonard Daly, was a real person, a painter, often mentioned among the panoply of outstanding Jamaican intuitive artists. A loyal husband, father, and an organic philosopher. Daly was not Rastafari, at least not at the time that I reasoned with him, but if nothing else, an iconoclast. His paintings, often dark and complicated, reminded me of the nightmarish quality of the early Hieronymus Bosch. Yet his philosophy was humanitarian. He believed in the redemption of even morally compromised people and was optimistic about the future of Jamaica and Jamaicans. This suggests the way in which the four more popular intellectual approaches, Marxism, Black Power, Rastafarianism, had come to prevail. There was room in the Jamaican matrix of the early 70s for the flooring of a variety of quixotic perspectives. One love, brother. How many years of mechanics, Porkmanism, land hunger, linseed poker spirits, smoking out a idle donkey rope, and rolled eye backward, curling round an ancient cosmic path, have led to these heights of reasoning. Up past heavy dub sound, past the science men, they try to keep me down. Ainana, Ilaloo, a gold shore climbing by, eyes herbs, and below, brighter in a kind of splendid way, Babylon Town, Dread City, under eye controls, plays on a jumpy beat, in clouds, hiding zinc, cover faces, warm a night breeze. And Akete tells of 14 youth and daughters, one more to come next month, and Sis D, a concrete wall, long mountain hillside, slide down, and coffee-grounded fish and chanting, couldn't wake a sleeping spirit. Yes, Beard Man, a long time now been trying to sight the heights, and couldn't find it. Someplace up a mountainside I feel a heart which sight a soul, and lick it up real loud. So from this time on I might change a slight, but never be the same again inside. Sight, one love. Popular culture. The movement of the 70s was driven by the popular culture of the time. In Jamaica, reggae was the soundtrack, and Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, and Dennis Brown were its prophets. But alongside the typical drums and bass of the reggae rhythm were other currents which competed for airtime. I wrote Count Mystic after a visit to Trinidad in 1973 of the East Kingston Rastafari jazz band, Count Ozzy and the Mystic Revelation of Rastafari. Count Ozzy and his group of Rastafari drummers have lived and played from the base near Warwick Hill in East Kingston for many years, and were popular on a number of early ska recordings, most notably O Carolina, which remains a turning point in the incorporation of Akete drumming into the popular idiom. Don Drummond and the Scatterlights, Carlos Malcolm and his Afro-Jamaican rhythms, and others had also grounded with Rastafari and with Ozzy in particular, through the club scene in East Kingston, and further links with Rastafari groups in West Kingston's Backer Wall and the foreshore area of southern St. Andrew. It was a chemistry, however, with Cedric Brooks, Joe Robles, and a group of young musicians influenced by the Coltrane avant-garde tradition that led to the MRR, Mystic Revelation of Rastafari, and the iconic 1973 triple album, Groundation. I was a student at the St. Augustine campus of the UWI when I met the Count, Cedric, Joe, and the other members in somewhat difficult circumstances after a stirring concert at Queen's Hall in Port of Spain. They had been invited to Trinidad on an arrangement with a well-known, every time I read this I laugh, with a well-known Trinidadian calypsonian who had lodged them in what was supposed to be a hotel, but was instead a house of ill repute on Charlotte Street in downtown Port of Spain. What was worse, he had subsequently abandoned them without paying for their series of performances. Fortunately, I, along with colleagues in the Guild of Undergraduates, the Student Council at the University of the West Indies, were able to plan at short notice a concert for them on campus and give them all the proceeds, allowing bills to be paid and for them to return home to Jamaica. On the night of the performance, tired from a hectic day of organizing the event, I arrived late and heard from a distance in the night the steady heartbeat of the Akete drums, building above the combined moan of bowed acoustic bass, baritone saxophone, and slide trombone. For me, it was as if a thunderstorm of Pan-African musical resistance had burst home. Just felt mystic. Mankind, you know, when it's hard for words to come to show just how warm a sounds can warm inside a man, a mystic sound, such as known only before, to quake inside a heart, a weak heart man who knows not dread, thunderstorm, a bolt of lightning, tree falling, down 12-story, glass and stress concrete cracking, underneath the strain, a wealth of academic talent runs in fear. Of rusty saxes, double bass and goat skin drums, or the parting of the waves. In May 1974, Marvin Gaye was at the height of his popularity. He had managed to transcend the easy love affair rhythm and blues of the early 60s with the remarkable Mercy Mercy Me album of 1968. And then in the early 70s, reinvented himself again as a post-revolutionary lover man in Let's Get It On. The Wailers, still with the full trio of Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, and Bonnie Livingston on board, were on the upward trajectory with their Catch a Fire and newly released Burning albums, climbing up local and international charts. None of the promoters nor any of Gaye's agents, however, would have put the Wailers to open for him when he performed in a concert in Kingston, Jamaica, if there had been any fear of their eclipsing the star, which is exactly what happened. Gaye had arrived in Kingston, unfortunately for him, at the very moment when the effervescent Jamaican urban black culture, epitomized in the style, lyrics, and stance of the United Wailers, rose to the surface. For Gaye, it was perhaps a major booking error, but for the Wailers, it was a triumphant arrival. I'm just going to read the last stanza of that poem, because it's a long for me poem, and I want to move along as quickly as I can. The last stanza of the poem, I think is important because it sets up something I want to say in my conclusion. Natty Dread, your guitar is a self-loading rifle. Your harmony is a thin black line of resistance. Natty Dread, blaze out your soul. Natty Dread, don't let I down. Natty Dread, wail out your soul. Natty Dread, don't let I down. Moving right along. Injustice. The prime motivation that inspired a generation into political activism was not, I suggest, religion, ideology, or philosophy, but rather a burning sense of injustice. Who burned down Jonestown, creating an exodus of refugees who ended up as a displaced community in Suffolk Heights, and why? Who killed the Gulf Caddy in the poem March 9, 1976 that I'm about to read, and why? Who provided the weapons, resources, and logistics for the coup against Salvador Allende, the elected president of Chile, and murdered him in La Moneda presidential palace? Who backed racist South Africa to invade independent Angola in order to force, at the point of a gun, a free black people into servitude and oblivion? All of these were considered by the youth as supreme acts of injustice, and all demanded resistance and commitment, as captured in these two poems. The first is simply titled March 9, 1976, and is self-explanatory. Tell me how much time do I have? 11 minutes? Okay. I'll just read one of them. I read March 9, 1976. In a packed dance hall, when the jump is on, and the muted dog want to eat itself, and the wood root mixed with the sweet center ivy, and the bass note alone stop the hydrant from flying. Not a man take notice of the yellow cortina and the 5 wrench faces inside. Circling round a burning spear number. Machine gun mentality centered on traps. Everyone check when the clappers first start. That burning spear really gone wild. When the fire stop burn and who no reach ground, scale the wall and the gully outside. 5 wrenches remain and 1 lead spattered martyr, awaiting its medal behind. Down Duke Street's closed boundaries, a crew-cut accountant ticks off a number, closes the doors, and a stars and scraps fire. Could the golf caddy know who fired his life, inspired this crime against the youth of the town? Crying, I sat, brown grass of a city, trying to out dry flames without tears. Revolution. The sense of imminent and palpable revolution was an integral aspect of the movement which gave it purpose and direction in the long 70s. In 1974, the Vietnamese had, after a bitter and bloody war with the French and then the Americans, won freedom through persistent and effective warfare against colonial and imperial interlopers. The conflict in Portuguese Africa was coming to a head, and it was the militant and Marxist revolutionaries of the MPLA, FRELIMO, and the PAIGC who were on the verge of taking power. Fidel Castro, a decade earlier, had taken power in Cuba, and after the successful defense at Playa Girón and the survival of the missile crisis was holding it effectively against the wishes of the United States, and where the revolution had succumbed to the forces of imperialism, as most notably in Chile, it was because the narrative suggested insufficiently militant policies had been followed. Thus, the narrative had been followed. Thus, the story goes that Allende was well-meaning but naive, and this accounted in large measure for the success of Pinochet's coup and the bloody suppression of the Chilean revolution. This sense of revolution was not only inevitable, but achievable through armed insurrection, because the objective conditions, both internationally and locally, were ripening, if not ripe, runs through many of these poems and through the times. This one is for the head of the National United Freedom Fighters in Trinidad and Tobago, who was shot by the Trinidadian police while engaged in a guerrilla movement in the northern hills of Trinidad in 1973. To a guy I knew, but didn't meet, and for the Trinbagodians, workers and students who feel and know what he felt, and to Carl who lies bronchial, somewhere in a living hell of Frederick Street. Bulleted flesh, powdered, lifeless stairs. Youth man, torn from the womb of tomorrow's morning, I stand choking. 1,000 miles away, the John Crows drool. Down the Red House Whitehall steps, the corbeau coolly wait to pick the bleached bones of a beach dream, long thought gone down the storm train of yesterday's hotel. And the rope lengthens, the crimes criminals multiply, and oil-fed SMGs belch out black blood, and countless unnamed who fell before you. Brother G, Sister B, and Bogle Garvey, Lumumba, Che, Amilcar Cabral will testify, for the tense black hands must dig the hole, and the hanging noose must tighten, and the living zombies of this day nightmare must fall out in the nightlight of our tomorrow's dawning. I have a poem on Angola here, which I'm not going to read, and I'm not going to read my Grenada poems, because I simply don't have the time. But I want to come to the last part of my presentation, which has to do with lamentation. The 1980 electoral defeat of Michael Mann, followed 3 years later by the tragic collapse of the Grenada Revolution, signaled the end of the long Caribbean 70s, Indeed, if one is to use a wider lens, it was also the end of 2 decades of black radicalism, evident in the collapse of the Black Power movement in the US, funneling of Iran-Contra funds to engineer a drugs crisis in inner cities, and the gradual incorporation of radical regimes in formerly Portuguese Africa into the mainstream of the neoliberal world economy. Philosophically, Marx and Keynes, strange bedfellows at best, had lost and Hayek had won. Allende's vision of a democratic road to socialism was replaced by Pinochet's iron fist in politics and open market economy, managed intellectually and practically by the Chicago boys. It was a time of lamentation, but also a time to take stock and consider on what ground a new and different kind of movement might arise again in the future. These, however, are not so much about the taking stock, but the lament. I'm going to read 2 poems. One is October 18 Night, which is 5 young men on the eve of the electoral defeat of 1980. And the second poem I'm going to read is about 3 WPJ cadres who were killed under still unexplained circumstances after 1980. So this is called October 18 Night. Me and Charlie and Richie and Bobo and Cap take a stop and hold a watch on the pitch black rooftop. Enough shut up. Bobo stop watch. Me and Richie get flat. Charlie start sleep. Not a peep from him for a while. Around 8 o'clock, pressure ease up. The radio start to crackle the news. Kingston gone. Clarendon gone. Spanish Town, well hot. Whole heap of man get dropped. Cap start to ball. Over him start crawl off the roof. Me and Richie still flat. Charlie, you must sleep on him back. Was the Charlie stop sleep. Rubbing chin with expectant grin. Who win? Him ask me and Richie. Richie hold on to him. He lose. And choose the green. It's a different scene when morning come. Charlie start weep. I start to cry. No one can sleep. Then start ring and shot still apart. We light a spliff and get back flat and take a stop and hold a watch till morning come. I'm going to read 2 points I said. First one is for Peter Tosh. I was going to read it. Peter Tosh's death well into the 80s is significant because he was, like Marley, a voice of resistance, but if anything, the more militant, or the most militant of the 3 leading wailers. And his death might very well be the date at which we want, from a Jamaican perspective, to consider the end of this era. This one is called Red. Blood. Red blood drips down the door strip, settles on the sill, slowly changing into gel, while sprawl across the crimson floor within, a lion mane will flash no more. A mystic man lies cold, his timing all undone. Mystic man, your time has gone. A needle scratches jaggedly, bisecting viney lines, messing up my mind. The sun is setting on your troubled land, sleeping fitfully in sweaty miasma from this tree-carved hand. Fear not, O sleeping one, your time is done, and night is long. But in the distance, see, morning come. Blue-black notes still bubble on, drums still crack and guitars strum, and we can't scatter when the sun has gone. And the final poem is called Shattered Glass, and it is for Pat Lewis, Junior Robinson, and Carl Burge. Oh, the morning dawn came, and the dewdrops stood on the sidewalk grass. The nightingale sang in red stood. School children sat in expectation, shading in the shadow of the moon. Mist gave way to light. Then the watchers and the waiters, the hubble and the clatter, the engines and the horns, the fumes and newspapers. Within sight, 3 young men alight, hands held high in nervous posture. Oh, the 3 young men with hands held high, backs against the concrete fence, jaws towards the sky. The cricket and the frog, the silence and the land, the thunder then the silence, and the slow motion tumble. Oh, the morning dawn calm, and the dewdrop stood on the crumpled red grass. The sun burns hot, and many more pass. The slander and the anger, the speeches and the numbers. Accidents never reveal their path, leaving only shattered glass. Nobody questions, nobody asks. Accidents never reveal their path, scattering only shattered glass. In conclusion, there are 5 themes that I set up, and I'm just going to mention literally the title of those themes, because I know I've gone on for a very long time, and I would really like to have a conversation on this paper in mind. The first is the question of certainty. The certainty that we were right and that change was inevitable. The second is the question of revolutionary violence, and it is the ease with which and the rapidity with which the thematics of these poems, and I would suggest the thematics of the times, turn to revolutionary violence as a solution. The third is masculinism, and I point out here to the extent to which many of these poems are themed in a masculine gender direction. Not only in the use of the people who are given agency, but also in the way in which crisis is addressed. The fourth is audacity. And there is something about the audacity of a generation, the willingness to confront local and international forces far superior in strength, which needs to be recorded and remembered and recaptured. And the fifth is the question of justice and injustice, and how, as I initially said early in the paper, that gave meaning to a generation and animated its direction and activities. Thank you.
Thank you, both of you, for such I think it's weird. Thank you both for such rich papers. I am not here to say much. I had 3 sort of questions that came to me in reading both your pieces. And I know that, I'm going to just not move. Is that what better?
It sounds good. It's fine? Yeah.
Anyway, I know that in organizing something like this, a symposium like this, sort of ask for the people that you want to be here, and then see what they turn in, and then hope that you can put them together in some way that makes sense. And so when I got these 2 papers, what I do with poetry and honors sort of semi-autobiographical reflection, but also a critical sort of reading of that time. And so the things that I want to ask come somewhat through where Honor started with the questions of memory. And I wasn't here yesterday, so I missed how that people entered into the conversation yesterday, unfortunately. But today, so far, with Kim, with Robert Lewis, don't know well enough about Rupert, and with Val, each of their presentations, talks, started with the autobiographical, started with who and where they were at the time that they're talking about. And so, given that, so either of these panels could have been called Autobiographical Reflections. And part of that reflecting is the narrating in a coherent manner. And Honor started with not wanting to do that coherent narrative, or wanting to undo or stay away from a coherent narrative. So my first question is, and it's been hard to frame it, but how doesn't a coherent narrative help us? What are the ways that we need a coherent narrative in what you're calling an embattled context then, but I would say now, too? How might this critical stance or critical reading of the time in a non-coherent way be working against something that a coherent narrative could give us? That's not as coherent as the thing I'm asking about, but there is something to be said for having a narrative that you can a way that you can frame the past in a coherent narrative to help us in the embattled context of the now. And both of you turned to Stuart Hall in different ways, and I've been thinking through that statement that the I that speaks is always enunciated, right? And so in the re-enunciating of the I re-enunciating the I that was enunciating then, does that make sense? Yes. You going back to the you that spoke then, both of you. Is there something that we can gain from that being a coherent re-enunciation? I'll stop there. The second thing I noticed was the necessity of distance for this re-enunciation. And so, Brian, you talked about distance in terms of geography, but there's, for both of you also, the distance of time, and Honor, you started today with, and this wasn't actually written in the draft that you got, the distance that you needed in terms of time to be able to talk about this. And so what is it that, in Autobiographical Reflections, the distance gives us in terms of the affect that we can somehow, we feel we can avoid, both in geography and chronology. And the third is those two things sort of together, with the distance from the archive that you were both mining at this time. What is it that you feel now cannot be captured? And I'm thinking here in terms of the body in your talk, Honor, and the question of sound in your coming to poetry, Brian. What are the ways that there are things that can't be captured and maybe should not be captured? That might be my own laying onto it, in order to, as you said, elude a fixity in the reframing. That's a little loose, but those are my three questions. And then there's some time for opening it up. So if you want to speak to that at all now, or I can go directly.
I'd like to look at your second question, which is the second question of going back. It's really quite remarkable because this work was literally put down for 2 decades, So it was, when I opened it up back, it was just as I described it. It was like an archive, except that I wrote this, and I do recognize that I wrote it, but it was in a different time and a different place. That will provide you with powerful motivation to think about it in that context. When these poems appear, they will appear with a context in the back which tries to contextualize them. But even so, so I'm not sure if I'm answering the question except to say that this is the closest I've come in looking at my own work, this creative work, to looking at it in a sort of very objective way. So who is this guy? And of course, there's a lot I recognize, but it's fascinating in that sense. The geographical question is also important too, because although it's abstract, it certainly gave me a sense of distance to consider it as something that could be done. I don't know how to describe that. So I'm just underlining that I think both are important and both worked to encourage me to do this.
Okay. Thanks very much for the I wondered, in the light of especially Autobiographical Reflections, how do you see Marlon James in the material? In which the period is constructed around Marley on one hand, and Ken Jones on the other hand. Some would say a bizarre construction, to say the least. But what might the question but I do wonder what you think of especially Marley. As you probably guess, who seems to me to be, shall I say, underrated lyrically, but overrated politically.
Sorry, Don, can you repeat that? Who is underrated? Marley.
Overrated lyrically, perhaps, but perhaps overrated politically. I don't know. I throw it out for what it's worth. It may not be worth it.
You want to collect? Sure.
We collect a few questions.
First of all, thank you for those papers. I have a comment and then a question. I'll sort of stuff it all in together. I was listening to what Brian was saying about the jazz, the Aussie's Eastern Mystic Jazz Band.
Mystic Revelation.
Yes, and the influences of culture. I was really glad you said that because I was thinking about the earlier panel with Rupert's discomfort with the word cosmopolitanism. And as I recall, Rupert said that cosmopolitanism is a word that he associates with the middle class and elitism, right? And here we have this wonderful example of how to destabilize the word cosmopolitanism in the Jamaican and frankly in many other contexts, that the word cosmopolitan does not belong to the middle classes. Here we have a jazz band, working class black Rastafari, listening to Coltrane, creating something that's inimitably Jamaican. And you know, if you take it further afield, you can think of Jamaicans and Caribbean people going to New York, to London, for all kinds of reasons. So that word does not belong to the middle class. And I really want to put that out there, that we need to think about, you know, challenging our own ideas about elitism and assuming that global influences come from the middle class. So thank you for that, Brian. I thought that was a really great example. Sort of moving to Honor's paper, really interested in how you started out with, I don't even know if this is Embodied cultural marijuana, and he brought up Louise Bennett. Very fascinating example, because of course Louise Bennett was a middle-class woman who was embodying what many people see as a stereotype of a bygone working class type, to make essentially critical, satirical, and protest discourse in Jamaica from the 30s right through to when she died in the early 21st century. But you know, I was thinking also about that in terms of your discussion of class and of gender, because of course first of all she's middle class, and she had to embody a type that is not where she's from. And are we saying that you have to be working class, that to embody resistance is to be working class? Now you did complicate that narrative about embodiment, but it seems that our examples always seem to be about embodying working class resistance, even, or just the working class. I was also thinking about it in terms of gender, because embodiment is, you mentioned Rex Nettleford as a form of his work as a kind of embodiment too. But I was also thinking about what it means to embody working class popular forms. We always, again, we tend to think of the working class black body, whether male or female, when we think about embodiment. Or to think about resistance. And I'm sorry, I'm sort of jumping here, but I'm thinking now about some of the research that is coming to light about 1930s Jamaica, where we see figures like Raka and Sandy. I don't know how many people are familiar with these comedy blackface duos, Bim and Bam, and more blackface duos, male blackface duos. We see them in Trinidad as well, who embodied what people are sort of castigate Louise Bennett for, these kind of mammy type or performances. And they are embodying a kind of popular performance. Are they doing similar things because they're wildly popular in the way that Louise Bennett is? Why is it that we don't talk about men in that way? And so I guess this is a little far afield, but is it possible to talk about an embodied male performance that is like Louise Bennett's, utilizing a kind of stereotype to make protest, to make a protest against a kind of a system? And B, can you talk about non-working class male embodied performances as well? Sorry about this. Thanks for that.
Non-working class male.
Sorry.
Can we go with the two questions?
We had two already?
Yeah, two already. That was Don's semi-question in the back that he may have retracted.
Don, look, I think that James's novel is a novel which could not have been written, I think, by somebody of my half generation removed from him. It had to have been written by him. James was, by the way, I can say, was a student of mine at UW. He told me that, I didn't know. Right? But so he was a student of mine. But not only could it not have been written by someone a half generation behind him, but it could only have been written by him once he had taken up residence outside of Jamaica. I think that freed him of some of the things that what you said, David? The burden of his burden, absolutely. What I made some of those points in a different way in relation to my own freedom to republish poems after having stepped out of the space. But in his case, it was a more urgent question because of a variety of other reasons associated with his own being and what his own being means in Jamaica.
You mean his sexuality?
Yes. So what I'm saying in other words is there are themes in that I think relate back to the question as to how you position characters like Marley that we need to think about through that lens. And again, you know, one can make whatever one wishes as an abbess of Mali or of anybody. And so one is not, I certainly think that we need to understand James in his, both in his geographical position, to rip off of Kelly's point, and as well in his own sexual positioning outside of Jamaica. What freedom that gives him to have a different take on the entire way in which Jamaica and its society is approached. I don't know if that is a helpful response.
To some degree, but I don't think that externality and sexuality part of it, but not the core of it. He's always operating and so on. But there's a positionality, let's use that word, of James. Sexuality, externality, notwithstanding, which is in question. Not on sexual issues, but on political issues. So that he takes a certain political stance, which, to my way of thinking, is essentially a conservative one, deeply conservative one, somewhat along the lines, if I may say so, of Silvio Winter, deeply conservative positions, which I don't think it's a matter of external and internal, although that aspect, but a matter of his own ideological, if you will call it that, or social position and political outlook and so on. It's more in that realm, so I see that. So I take your point, but I think there are these other things which reflect the neoliberal age, which it's more reflection on the ambience of the period that he's living in, whether he's in Jamaica or not, and so on. So this is how I kind of see it.
I think I'll start at the top. I don't know how we're going to do this, but on coherent narrative, yes, I do think coherent narratives are good, and it's in the interest of kind of creating a coherent narrative that I think it's important to kind of recuperate some of the things that actually worked well and that actually were important and inspiring moments in the period. And I think there's a lot of that. And in the and those tend to get forgotten. That in the relentless critique of the period, I think that a lot of the really creative responses get forgotten. So it's in the interest of that, of recuperating some of that I'm trying to talk about going to pieces that might get overlooked because they didn't work or because they were not appropriate for their time. And so, well, one example that we were talking about in the break was the gay liberation movement. We're talking with Matthew, I think he's a student. You know, there were many things, the period allowed many openings. One of the things that we forget is that there was a gay struggle going on, and that there was an organization going on there very early on, and so, you know, I think that we have to be careful how we make it coherent, because the coherence might cause us to lose things that aren't there. So that's one thing. I don't know how to answer the question about recuperating things. I think the only way I can do is to take refuge in some kind of notion of, which is really to duck the question, non-linear time. I can't untangle my desires in the moment from my desires now, and I can't untangle the I that I am now in a way from trying to recall the I that I was then. So I do think the distance has enabled me to talk about it very simply without bursting into tears. And if I were to burst into tears in front of you, I would become the subject of your inquiry rather than the period, and this conference is not the Honor Fortsmith conference. So that's all that I can offer you in that regard. On the question of Bennett and the body and so on, this is something I've thought a lot about. There's a lot to say about it. I think a lot of how the body gets taken up and seen, and what is required at a particular moment has to do with the context and the discourses that are already in circulation. That's what is allowed. So I feel like Bennett is not a person her work encompasses a huge amount of time. It is not the same throughout. It shifts and it changes. Arguably in Don's terms, because Don has a particular notion of the political, which is a little different tonight. Her most political would have been maybe the early period, when she was very outspoken about race, and she made a number of critical comments about them in her poetry. Later on, after 1940s, there's a kind of shift when she sort of gets incorporated into the sort of offshoot of the Drumblare group that is controlling the new cultural establishment that is coming up through the National Pantomime and LTM and things like that. And she sort of compresses everything into this one figure, which is costumed in the way that it is. And I think she does it because it's legible. And because she also, I think, is committed to the notion of unity. And she wants to be legible on both sides, I think. And so she can get taken up in different ways depending on who's watching her. She can be non-threatening and the laughing mammy, but she can also be the trickster and somebody who is also non-threatening. So I think she inhabits that particular in-between terrain. And I think it's somebody, when I was doing work on Louise Bennett, somebody, Alma Mokian, said something very interesting to me. She said to me, Louise Bennett was popular in a way that Carmen Manley never could be. And Carmen Manley was, I can barely remember what Carmen Manley looked like, but she said, Carmen was glamorous and black and very beautiful, but never had the appeal, and a good actress, but never had the appeal of Bennett. What was needed at the time and wanted at the time was something that ordinary working women could identify with, because it was an opening. It was a particular opening, a democratic opening at that moment in the late 40s. So I think that has something to do with it. I don't know if that's answering your question. Now, on men, Ronnie Williams comes out of the garden movement, and he achieves, people know him because he begins to perform at Eloise Park, and he is castigated for being too working class in his demeanor and in his way of performing in the newspaper, the Garvey newspapers at the time, and he's basically told to clean up his act and to appear more respectable because he's got to bear the aspirations of the movement. And he never really does. He kind of slips back and forth as the general, but I think that is very instructive, that the formal face of the movement was seen as something that had to conform to a particular notion of middle-class respectability. On the other side, there's a guy like Cupidon, who is a very interesting character, who does a lot of cross-dressing, and is hilarious. And he's sort of the Oliver Samuels of his generation. I don't know if any of you are old enough to have seen Cupidon. I only ever heard of him. But he did a lot of cross-dressing, gender bending, and also I think he was lower middle class, and I think he performed in and out of different class positions.
Just a small note. Marcus Garvey really liked Ernest Cupidon. So he hated Claude McKay, but he liked Ernest Cupidon in all his cross-dressing glory.
So yeah, so I think that there's something going on there where there's a kind of dependence of one image on the other. So that there's a kind of dependence of the notion of respectability on the notion of this vulgar other, and that somehow the two exist possibly together. So that's as coherent as I can be about that.
I'll take the question.
It's 4:30. It's about 20 minutes.
Thank you for those papers. I had a couple of questions that have to do with, I'm going to put this right here. A weekend ago, a bunch of us gathered at University of Pittsburgh, the Center for African American Poetry and Poetics, to re-examine Hortense Buehler's A Crisis in Negro Intellectual Posting, Harold Cruse's 1968 account of the creative intellectuals' place in American society after the Revolutionary War. And what Buehler talks about in the essays about risk and bravery, she refuses the kind of logic of the heroic personality. She talks about keepers who are like overseers in the profession. And so as I sit here, someone who met Mr. Nelford before he died and spoke to him for a while, I'm thinking about how one takes a kind of a period of an epoch, of an era. And I'm wondering what may be useful in this moment. And I like both papers, and there's a tension here that's really kind of interesting to me. They have to do with domesticity, memory, and the kind of limits of nostalgia. And how do we self-critically, as a way, as Buehler says, to unorient ourselves, look forward, right? And so the first paper talked about what might not have been possible or successful, and how we can look at that unflinchingly and then move forward. And I'm wondering, and you mentioned, it might have came up before, Matthew mentioned it about queerness, right? So the embodied performance or disposition or enactment of someone like Rex Nettleford in a conservative country like Jamaica, on this side of history, must be named really precisely and directly, it seems to me. Like, it took a while for us to name, until Dr. Robotham mentioned, we're talking about Marlon James's sexuality, right? And might it be the case that what we know more, the question is that what do we know now? What we know now about Jamaican life is not a static thing. And so queer is not a static thing. So queerness, as a tool, as a lived reality, becomes a site for embodied performance, embodied memory that will expand, give us new vistas for perceiving that period. What might it mean that, the kind of moment of nationalism that we can call the 1970s, that leads into a narrowing of neoliberal politics and also representations, that it turns up in an unnamed figure, like, misnamed figure like Rex Nettleford, who my parents knew and never talked about, could not say the word he's a homosexual. So what kind of perspective, with J Flag being present now, right, and the other kind of campaigns across the island, what kind of perspective on that period might we get if we expanded to include queer people? They have to do with domesticity, memory, and the kind of limits of nostalgia. And how do we self-critically, as a way, as Buehler says, to unorient ourselves, look forward, right? And so the first paper talked about what might not have been possible or successful, and how we can look at that unflinchingly and then move forward. And I'm wondering, and you mentioned, it might have came up before, Matthew mentioned it about queerness, right? So the embodied performance or disposition or enactment of someone like Rex Nettleford in a conservative country like Jamaica, on this side of history, must be named really precisely and directly, it seems to me. Like, it took a while for us to name, until Dr. Robotham mentioned, we're talking about Marlon James's sexuality, right? And might it be the case that what we know more, the question is that what do we know now? What we know now about Jamaican life is not a static thing. And so queer is not a static thing. So queerness, as a tool, as a lived reality, becomes a site for embodied performance, embodied memory that will expand, give us new vistas for perceiving that period. What might it mean that, the kind of moment of nationalism that we can call the 1970s, that leads into a narrowing of neoliberal politics and also representations. That it turns up in an unnamed figure, like misnamed figure like President Alford, who my parents knew and never talked about, could not say the word he's a homosexual. So what kind of perspective, with J Flag being present now, right? And the other kind of campaigns across the island, what kind of perspective on that period might we get if we expanded to include queer people, gays and other women, that are not of a certain social democratic moment, either uptown or downtown, who are not simply working class, because we cut through all of that and complicate all of that and add contradiction to all of it. So if we talk about embodied performance, what does our history look like in the long 1970s if, without gestures or simply need to kind of add homosexuality and stir, that we really interrogate the histories of Black queer people in the 1970s?
Thank you for both your questions. Thank you for your presentations. Honor, I had a question. So I kind of want to go back to the conversation that I think that you started that we didn't quite get to. And I think so. I think the argument that you're making, my understanding of the argument that you're making, is around sort of Sistren as a means of the way in which Sistren acted was a means of decolonization through embodied practice. I'm wondering, maybe that's kind of what I'm taking away from it. And I'm wondering how that relates to earlier your questions about food, and how food is really central, I guess, I think to Rich, so I think to Rich's point earlier, I think the notion of embodiment gets to be around sexuality, gets to be around food, and I'm wondering if this was addressed, issues of food or nutrition, or even like land reform, which is necessary for a more equitable, because that was happening in the 70s as well, if that was addressed at all in Sistren's work, sort of in the work, just to kind of loop back to the point that you had started making earlier, and how it relates to like the broader argument that you're making. Now, I'd love to hear you talk more about that.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian, for your papers. Loss and recovery. The things I see linking both papers. And in Brian's revisiting and repossession of his poetry, I think we might want to spare a thought for the link between Bob Marley and WPG. This link, really not a link, but after the peace concert, there was an article written by Eileen Thomas in Struggle, not under her name, but I knew she wrote it. And she definitely took a side of Tosh's performance as against Bob Marley's performance. Bob had read the article, and he came on campus with somebody else, friend, colleague, or what have you, looking for Trevor Monroe. And I said, Trevor wasn't there. Rupert, Louis, Alex, Trevor was upstairs. Needless to say, I was kind of scared. Because Bob alone, I would not have been scared, but Bob and another man come up to quarrel about. In fact, Bob's attitude was not querulous attitude. He was probing as to, how could you publish this article? Did you understand what I'm trying to do, given the violence in the society? So I mention it because this is how you have recovered these poems. They are memories that I have and people in the movement would have had, because there's a dialogue that was going on between Bob's music and lyrics and the entire progressive movement in Jamaica. There was a relationship. And what has happened since that time, which nobody can really change, is that there's just been this kind of reconstruction of a Bob Marley mythology and empire that completely blocks out these smaller but important moments of contention and trying to see, he too is trying to cope with the challenges of the 60s and 70s. So the newspapers brought that memory back to me.
I want to express my appreciation for the broadening of the intellectual landscape that both of you provided us, because we tend to think of intellectual culture as only up at UWI or in the arts outside of the campus. So we have a much broader intellectual landscape or a tapestry from which to draw to understand the Jamaican cultural formation in the 1970s. And that can be instructive for understanding the variety and streams from which we can draw for alternative projects and alternative futures. I think we may be too pessimistic about the failures of the 70s and the defeatism that I hear in the room today. I want to propose an alternative in which we saw the 70s as a period in which black presence was disruptive of Jamaican Eurocentrism, Creole Eurocentrism, so that black presence was insurgent in the state, demanding recognition, cultural recognition, demanding acknowledgement of political participation, and demanding and achieving the wresting of welfare from the state, so that these things became distorted, appropriated, and deformed, but nonetheless presented the hegemons with a challenge that they could not refuse. And so what we have here is an insurgent movement that challenged the entire apparatus of the state and its functions on the question of recognition, the identity, the question of participation, the question of welfare. So the question I ask, therefore, is what are the consequences of this failed attempt to create a more just society in terms of the structure of the state that is post-communist and post-Westphalian, so that it could better recognize these claims on something different from the modern state system that we currently have established here.
Let me just start with Rich first. I think, first of all, I agree with the assumptions that I think are present in your question. And your question has also embedded in it its own answer, in that we need to write new histories, and we need to write new histories that honor the silences that accompany certain kinds of oppression, which were there then and continue to be in the Jamaican context now. And that those new histories will not just be, as you correctly put it, to add and stir, but to rethink what a vision of liberation without addressing questions of deeply embedded homophobia is, and whether it can be a vision of liberation, and therefore what a vision of liberation is liberated from that limitation would look like. So I think those are histories to be written and contemporary situation to be examined. But I take your point as a very important one, and that it is there is a way the silences are as damning as the actual statements which are made. The silences on these questions. In my own poems of the 70s, the question does not rise. It does not rise. Was I editing something, or was there just an atmosphere of general silence surrounding everything, of which the poet was simply a part of? Right. Complicit, or at least ignorant, complicit, whatever. But I think it's a point which deserves to be a question which needs to be answered by the writers and the recorders of history and by the contemporary intervention. So I just want to say, I support where your question was leading. Obika, I'd like to answer your question by addressing a point that Kim Robinson Walcott made in assuming that the retreat of Nike at the end of the novel, Painted Town Red, was a sign of defeat, right? And Kim, I told Kim this last night. That's not how I read it, right? It was a sign of he who fights and runs away lives to fight another day. That is Anansi, writ large, right? We're too weak to fight. We have suffered a major blow, but we don't give up. And by using the language of Marley and his whole style, come back to David Spanter's style, how he accords himself, right? And he disappears in the frantic traffic, but he will be back again when Heathen's back is against the wall, right? So I read that as
You wrote that.
For sure. Having wrote it, the reader, the writer don't reads. And years later, I opened the archive. I read it as preserving, as survivors, black survivors, we get battered and bruised, but we come back and we fight another day. And so there's hope. Where there's life, there's hope. So the point I'm making is that there is a trove of cultural and social wealth that has derived out of the 70s, a sense of self, a sense of being that has propelled people into the world, into new spaces, into second and third diasporas, but in Jamaica itself, which has provided a sense of survival and a sense of organization, which I don't underestimate that. It hasn't taken the form of a victory in an election or a revolutionary state day one. We're going to reinvent the terms, I am the eternal optimist, right? And I think some battles have been won and some have been lost. One of the areas in which Jamaican people have won is that the educational advantages that were gained out of the struggles of the 70s Jamaicans have gone forth into the world, into spaces like Brooklyn, and into spaces like Brixton, and into Brampton, and have in a sense transformed those spaces, their own families and their own lives in unimaginable ways, building on a foundation of universal free education or of access to university education, which was hard fought for and won in that period and lost subsequently. But generations have benefited from it. How do you measure that? Because there's not a state victory. At the same time, what are the shortcomings of that? Which it's not zero sum here. What needs to be done?
Can you just talk about the state what possible states we could imagine, given those struggles, based on what the people say they want?
Well, that's a bigger question, right? And you and I, that is the substance of our daily. That is what brothers us every day, right? And animates us. So we will have that discussion, and we'll have had that discussion. But absolutely, that is one dimension of it. But the other dimension is to imagine a social moment that has made the world completely different. And made people's lives completely different because of that social. Is that zero sum? I think not. But is it the revolution? I think not either. But is there ever the revolution? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that in the same way as offering a queer reading of the period would be very helpful and would also reveal a lot. I think that taking account of any of the kind of methodological principles that come out of thinking through the body might be helpful in revealing a lot of things that we think about. Certainly food would be one, certainly space would be another. Land would be one, but also space would be another. I think the spatial question is something we didn't really think about in terms of how, where we are, reproduces what we're able to see and not see. I think Don mentioned yesterday how different Kingston is now to when he was growing up, and how that the way that the built environment has developed allows us to see particular things. So I do think that focusing on those things, I'm just calling for attentiveness to some of the things that might come up if we try to think through an embodied method that also quarrels with old sort of identities and representations that have been put into circulation. That's it.
Me?
What do you mean when you raise your hand?
Yeah, I would like to ask a question. Two questions. One principally for Brian, and one principally for Honor. Honor, I was struck by your invocation and you're talking about Netford and the Netford of the 1970s because of the ways in which, curiously or perhaps not, Netford is absent or absenting by the left, by and large. Mirror is barely a part of this discussion. And further back, the short form of the question is, when you invoke Netford, is it your current reflection on the ways in which Netford helps us to understand them, or are you talking about the centrality of Nettle's embodied presence in dance theatre, then the way in which, for example, Sistren understood its practices? For the emerging feminist left of the 1970s, Committee on Progress, the work in Sistren, was Nettleford then a figure at all? And in what way, who was Nettleford to you then?
Well, those are great questions, and I have to write them down. Well, like I say, untangling the temporalities is difficult, but I think we needed Rex sometimes. Like when Lynette was in prison, it was Rex that we went to ask to help with that. Rex was, as you know, a contradictory figure, but I think that contradiction was, in a way, a highly productive contradiction. I think that, frankly, and I could be very wrong, a lot of why he didn't get taken up by the left had to do with his queerness. I mean, I really do think that probably had to do with it. It was, there's this elaborate silence around it, maintained a lot by him, because he also didn't like to speak about it publicly, and docked opportunities to speak about it actively, and, now even at the end when things were becoming more activist, Rex had opportunities to speak and never spoke. But so, there's a lot to think about there. But and I don't quite remember where I was going with that. But I do think that that did have to do with why he wasn't taken up. And then he inhabited this kind of dissident masculinity, which was this dancer.
Yeah.
This black boy from the country, rural Jamaica, dancing in front of the cinemas in Montego Bay when he was a child, not respectable, and then going to Oxford, but insisting on maintaining this kind of rather degenerate habit of the theatre, which is how high culture saw the theatre. It's the sort of vulgar, it's always the vulgar cousin in literature. So I think those things had to do with it. And then there was Rex's insistence on always maintaining this, what he called cultural marinage position, which was this and I think he saw it as something that was unco-optable, because he was always carrying on about institution building. And I didn't start out thinking that Rex's work was important. I came to feel that way, I think, after having worked with him, or under him more than with him. And it was through that I came to respect both him and Neville, because of what they were able to do in that time. So I forget where I was going with that.
I'm not sure how far one can make direct claims about Rex's sexuality. I mean, speaking about queer or dissident masculinity, maybe a more substantive way of, I don't know if anybody here knows that, quote, Rex was homosexual. So I think we perhaps,
let's call it, let's do it the other way then, and say,
I think definitely, certainly.
But I think that there was a fair amount of homophobia around him.
Oh, absolutely.
But that homophobia also sustained his visibility. So it's interesting, that in itself, and he's not the only figure. There are other figures to whom this applies. So, we could talk lengthily about this, and I think just bringing it out.
I agree with you on that. And Rex was very indirect in me. I remember Rex once saying to me that part of the reason he was able to maintain friendship with Michael Manley is that he was not going to steal. He didn't have a wife that Michael Manley could steal. So Rex says to me, and obviously it's an indirect reference to his own. Anyway, but I think Rex is a really fascinating figure for us to trouble over, because of course he becomes to be very important to the former left in the 90s onwards, right? In many ways, to Rupert, to Barry, he becomes a very important enabling intellectual figure now, not just someone who can get you out of jail. So anyway, this is somewhere I think. The question for Brian, I'm one of those who remembers the Ku Klux clips from them times. I remember that as a younger JC boy. But the question is about Kim's reading. So I was thinking about that as you responded to her. And when you said you are an eternal optimist, I suddenly recognized where we quarreled, you and I. I'm not an eternal optimist. But I wonder whether, in a sense, Donnett's term here, interim time, is the time of Mikey at the end of your life. And it is a time when a progressive, an assumption about a horizon that is to come is ruptured in such a way that you can mouth, you live to fight another day, but in a certain sense, the bottom has fallen out of that temporality. And I think this is how I heard Kim reading it. There's a certain sense in which it's like Merle's angel at the end of the novel Angel, where she's lighting her candle by the river. There is a certain sense in which the time has come to an end. I mean, Mikey, like Angel, may reach for that kind of language of a future to come. But in some sense, given the temporal character of the novel itself and the disaster or catastrophe that has befallen, not just the figure, but the movement that sustains the figuration of the figure, that there is in fact nowhere to go with Mikey's story.
Well, I know
optimist as me.
But I know that is your position. Therefore, we have to agree to disagree, because an ending is also a beginning, and an interim is the interim between one ending and another beginning. But an ending is never absolute, and the point is that if we are to carry it logically, I have to read what was probably never meant when it was originally written into it. Then it is his style which he has still. It is his style. He trims and shaves and then goes back to becoming a dreadlock. And that statement, that act in the face of neoliberalism and in the context of everything is in itself an act of resistance.
But Rastafari in the 70s is not Rastafari in the 80s,
Absolutely, absolutely. And we can look at all of that and come to the conclusion that therefore it is an ending. But I'm saying it's not the conclusion I'm coming to.
So we can, so we have one more? Yeah.
I want to quarrel a little bit with David and Kim on the ending of Paint It On Red. I can yell plenty loud enough. Just to say, I mean, adding to what Brian is saying, right? I think it's also important, unless I'm misremembering, to consider geography, right? Anna was talking to us about space, and one of the things that happens is that while the kind of past and the first two temporalities of the novel are circumscribed by Kingston, right? And Mikey's kind of well, first, I mean, his imprisonment, but when he's out, his relentless circulation, both before and after that imprisonment, across the many barriers the social economic barriers that are inscribed in Kingston, but always within Kingston. At the end of the novel, he leaves, right? So I think there is something about space. I think there's a gesture that is made to a different horizon in the leaving of Kingston. And if I'm not misremembering Brian, he's also in that rural space that he's gone to. He's involved in work with kids, right? He's enabling educational possibilities for kids who, in his absence, might not have had that kind of opportunity, right? So it's not, I mean, I take the point about his style, but it's not just his style that he walks out at the end of the novel and out of the borders of Kingston with.
Thank you.
I don't know why they did it. I don't know why. I think we have to. You want to do one more? Okay.
Oh.
I was just wondering, that you were talking about middle strata, like white person, women, and the fact that you weren't rethinking decolonizing your own subjectivity. And I wondered if that is something that can be done after the fact, or can be done now that that same time and group and place aren't there, and if you could expand on it.
Well, this is something I like to talk to Kim about, because this is why I love Kim's work. Kim gets to this, the way in which middle-class subjectivity is a problem. And racialized subjectivity is a problem. But she also gets to talk about a kind of dissident whiteness, with which I would identify. I don't think I'm typical of my class. And I think, and so I think this work forces us to consider what that relationship is, and how we have in taking one, that we have to take it apart. And that when we take it apart, and this is also something Rex used to say, and Fanon says it too, you know, we've got to look at colonizer, colonized together. And I think that colonization is continuing. It's not finished. It didn't finish in 19 whenever, and it's still going on, and it's got a lot, there's still a lot there to untangle. So I do think that there is a serious project there. Alongside that, I do think that our colonial education, in a way, predisposed us to, at that period, and maybe still, to not to question certain assumptions about modernization. And this is where I come back to food again. This is food, land, these kinds of things. What we ate then, what the assumptions that we were taught. Chris Cozier in Trinidad makes fun of this all the time. This kind of, you know, we mustn't carry roti to school, we must carry sandwich. We must, you know, this I think is also a part of the things that we have to think about when we come to decolonize that kind of subjectivity that is a way, that is identified as whiteness. But I also think that Caribbean whiteness is very precarious. You know, I again and again experience changing racial categories all the time myself. And this has to do both with the racial formation of the different countries that I go back and forth in, but it also has to do with the fact that Caribbean whiteness is kind of precarious. It is very much, it is not even, it's barely a category. And so I think there's a lot of work to do there too. And I think that when we start to do that work, we maybe get put in touch with the work of somebody like Toussaint, who I think had some kind of brilliant, was kind of one of the first people to kind of articulate the social construction of whiteness as a kind of revolutionary form when he declared his allies black. When he declared his Polish allies black. It was Stylie. And I think that there's a kind of inclusiveness to Caribbean blackness that we can articulate in a new way, that we can talk more, much more about than we have done. And that the category black comes to be much more expansive, much more inclusive, much more diverse when we start to interrogate the categories black and white in the context of the Caribbean.
Yes. That is it.